And we are back with Dr. Frank Lance, and we are going to talk to him today about the air we breathe. Welcome to the conversation, Dr. Lance. How you doing today?
I am doing so well, and thank you so much for offering me this opportunity to come before your audience.
Oh, for sure, for sure. We are here to learn so much about you in conversation. About the air we breathe. You know that we've been talking about redlining. We're very interested in being purposeful community developers in real estate. And really, these conversations are helping us crack the code on breaking those barriers that have been in place since the very beginning, right? We've gotten a good history lesson by now. And we understand that these are lines that were designed to keep us out, to keep us away from better. So when we talk about the air we breathe, what comes first to you in that conversation?
So that, I think, is a really good question. I'm glad we start there. And even how you opened that, allow me just as I answer this question to step back. You talked about that this is by way of design. You also use this word intentionally of code. One of the things that I hope to bring up as we talk is this coded language that has been used since the very inception of this country to talk about people of color. And this coded language has led to these intentional practices that have created what we call red line communities. And so when you ask, what do I think about when I think about the air we breathe? I think about the fact that in most cases we have, quote unquote, these inner city areas. Dr. Brown will call them the black butterfly in Baltimore City, but we have these areas where we have issues with air quality and tree quality and water quality. We have issues with the heat index. We have issues that come from the fact that we've been forced into almost tenement style housing and enclaves that have left us one person on top of another. So one of the things that I love to bring up when I have these kind of discussions, for those of us who would remember the sitcom Good Times, in the jingle, there's a line that says, just looking out of the window, watching the asphalt grow.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many people miss that, but that poetry was so powerful because it talks about the damaging and traumatizing efforts that come from these kind of redlining things. Think of the language again. Just looking out of the window, watching the asphalt grow. Let me back up. I want to make sure people get it. Does asphalt grow? It does not. It is saying, here I am in tenement style public housing where I have nothing else to do but look out of the window at asphalt. That's not the holistic life that we were told was possible to us. But that is what intentional racial policies, that is what intentional public and political policies do. When you create these kind of communities, you remove hope, you remove dreams, you remove visions. And so when we talk about the air we breathe, I want air that breathes in hope. I want air that brings in power. I want air that breathes in dreams to let me know that anything that I can envision is impossible. But redline communities remove all of those. And so when we talk about the air we breathe, I want air that says I have hope, dreams, power, and not air that takes away my ability to live life and live it more abundantly.
Wow. And furthermore, we're deserving of it.
We're deserving of it.
Yeah.
We have divinity running through our veins. Right?
That's powerful.
And so that humanity and that divinity deserves the best that's possible. Redline communities take that away from us.
Speaking of redlining, how does redlining then impact green spaces in particular?
Okay, so the way in which redlining impacts green spaces, what redlining did was confine and restrict where a person of color could live. So let me deal with Baltimore City for a moment in order to answer this question about how it impacts green spaces. In 1950, Baltimore City was 949,000 people. Today, Baltimore City is 585,000. There has been a precipitous and continuous drop in population since 1950 over the last 70 years, as we've gone from 949,000 people to 585,000. So the question may be, why do I raise this in relationship to green space? Because what that meant was, at the height of Baltimore City, you needed a place, and remember, Baltimore City is majority Black. So you needed spaces that could house the people of color. And again, that's 1950, that's leading up to 1950. So when you take that population for a majority Black city, that meant with redlining, you confined that population into certain geographical spaces. What that also meant was that you could not afford green space because you needed housing. And so by restricting and confining people of color to certain areas, which is what redlining did, because there were covenants that said you could not live in certain other places, nor could someone there even sell their home to a person of color. You restricted the availability of green space because what you needed was housing for this demographic. And so what those policies did would say, I'm just going to give you a tenement style place in which to live, and not the quality of life you deserve by way of green space, because I really don't care about your humanity. I really don't care about your divinity. I'm just doing something I feel that I have to do, i.e. give you a space to live, but I'm really not trying to make it the place that where you can thrive and you can just go from there and live out your dreams. And so the redlining, and allow me, you talked about, even as you open, that we've been taught by now, redlining, just to make sure people get it. In 1937, the Homeowners Loan Corporation created a map, 1937, a map of Baltimore that had different color areas. An area that was colored in red was a place where people of color already lived. If it was colored in yellow, it meant they would soon live there. If it was colored in green, then this was a place in green that you could sell home to people that were not of color. So, and actually the way it further even went to say, if you were in a red community, you couldn't even get FHA housing. And so here what we did was remove resources. We removed capital. We removed the ability to have schools be their best. We removed the ability for parks to be their best, and said here, I'm going to remove everything that you need to thrive. And if you fail to thrive, even though I've removed your resources, that's your fault, not mine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
And so what it did then, how does it impact green spaces? It said, I've got to house you here because you can't live other places. Therefore, you don't have enough green space.
Which puts a different tone on the word ghetto. That ghetto is not because of my skin color. It just so happens that if you put those kinds of conditions on any type of people, you would create a ghetto. What I'm trying to say is that ghetto doesn't mean, when we say ghetto, we immediately get a visual because that word has been placed on people of color because of the environment in which we had been put into. We are not ghetto, but the conditions on a people perhaps create a ghetto. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I am so glad. You have no idea how excited I am that you raised that. So I am one, and I talk all the time about the power of words. The word ghetto by definition is not negative. The word ghetto by definition is talking about an area in which people of a similar ilk live. As you say, it has been misconstrued. It has been given this other definition to look at it pejoratively, to look at it negatively, and therefore say that people of color are ghetto. If you do what you just said, so look, a ghetto, Beverly Hills can be a ghetto by definition of ghetto, right?
Right.
What I would love for us to do is understand what the word really means, and then remove the negative influences that other people are trying to place on us,
Sure.
right? Let's not live down to their vision of us. God, I need somebody to hear that. Let's not live down to
Yeah.
somebody else's vision of us.
Yeah.
It is indeed a ghetto when you have people, and another word people can use is enclave. It is indeed a ghetto. As you said, any area can be a ghetto if this area is one in which you have an over concentration or saturation of a particular people of ilk. That by
Right.
itself is not negative. The thing that becomes negative is when you are placed in this situation and all the resources are removed, and then we look at you and say, now you need to thrive there, but I've removed all the resources.
Right.
You can't get housing, you can't get adequate insurance. It might be a food desert. The schools are underperforming, and you're in this place, and I'm expecting you to thrive, and I've removed all the resources. That doesn't happen other places. So please, people, as you watch this, as you listen, as you're with us today, please understand the term in and of itself is not negative. Do not allow yourself to live down to somebody else's impression of you. Understand who you are, and therefore live above their impression, live to the level that you know you were designed to live. A ghetto by definition is not negative. The issue becomes when I force you in a certain area by way of redlining and then remove all the resources and expect you to thrive in that.
And then judge you and create stereotypes. We could go on and on and on, but these are the things that have come about from redlining. Wow. Let's go from ghettos to green spaces. What is a green space? Why is it important? What happens in a green space? Why is it significant? Take us there, Dr. Lance.
Green spaces, parks, passive space, active space, playgrounds are essential to one's quality of life. And we really saw it during the height of COVID. Almost everything you saw, almost everything you read said it was good for people to get outside, take a walk, enjoy the outdoors. So envision an area. And so even as O'Hare Development and others try to redevelop, because Baltimore City, I mentioned again, we're at 585,000 people. So I need somebody to understand the impact of that. That means that housing that was needed for 950,000 people, you only have 585,000. So over 360,000 people that once needed housing in Baltimore are no longer here. Therefore, Baltimore City right now is at the precipice of redevelopment. And as you redevelop, green space has to be a part of that. We can have the best in housing, but also you need that green space. The question was why? Because that is the place where you get to go outside, you get to walk, commune with your thoughts, commune with your environment. You get to meet people who are also in your area. You get to have a place where your kids can run and play and be healthy. You get to have a place where you can go out with your pets. You get to have a place where you can breathe fresh air. These are all of the things that come with green space. These are all of the things that come with being outdoors. And I mentioned earlier that there are different types. You can have a passive space, which simply means it's a big open area. It's multi-use. You can use it however it best suits you. If you just need to get outside and put out a blanket and just lay there in the sun or do yoga, great. If you just need a place to walk, great. You can have an active space, which is already pre-programmed. Typically, we find this in parks. There are amenities there that you go and you use them. It might be the playground equipment, might be a running track, might be a swing, but it's already there. And then also what's essential, and we have these with our schools, there must be state-of-the-art playgrounds for our kids. So STEM is great. I absolutely love it. My education is, I'm an IT guy. I'm trained as an engineer. But life is not complete with just what you do academically. There also has to be this facet, this part of your life in which you're getting outside and you are having fun. And so our kids also need playgrounds. And so The essential impact of green space is it gives me a place to live my life holistically. Yes, I still work. Yes, I still have things to do at home, but I can take a walk. I can run.
Yeah.
I can play with my kids. I can lay out in the sun. It,
Hmm.
the best communities in this country are the ones that have great housing, a
Yeah.
place to shop, and green spaces.
When you're saying that, areas like Columbia, Maryland,
Great example.
leafy green. I mean, they've got trees, parks, water.
Great example.
Uh,
But as you know, though, so you raised Columbia. Columbia is a planned community. So it
mhm,
didn't just happen. This
mhm.
was by design. And this is what I'm saying for Baltimore City. So for Columbia, every time they designed housing, they also talked about shopping or a town center in those little villages. They also talked about green space. And so the biggest one is Centennial Park, right? So in Baltimore, as we redesign, as we rebound from coming down from 949,000 to 585, as we rebound and we redesign and we redevelop, we too have to be just as intentional. How do we do housing? And how do we do shopping? How do we do entertainment? How do we do green space? And how do we take advantage of one of the largest public parks in the country, 774 acres of Druid Hill Park, right? So all of this needs to come into play, but I'm saying it needs to be intentional.
It needs to be intentional, and certainly I'm assuming, and this will be a great question. Intentional, sure, but who needs to sit at the table for that intention to really come alive?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question because for far too long, we've just assumed that the local elected officials would make something happen. We just passed an election. People are talking about democracy has spoken. The power by way of the republic in which we live is with the people. And so the people in their communities need to have a voice and need to articulate and raise that voice to talk about what they absolutely demand. Here's what happens with elected officials. If your voice isn't raising, if your vote isn't being cast, in a lot of cases you get ignored. But the more that you come together and you build a unified voice and you demand the amenities and resources you need, the more you get what you actually need in your community. So I encourage us, organize. I encourage us to ideate, have ideas, have vision, put it on paper, and then take it to people, foundations, elected officials, community associations, but make your community what you actually demand and deserve.
This conversation is a part of a 3-day virtual class called Disrupting the Line, and I'm with Dr. Frank Lance of Parks and People, and we are having a conversation about the air we breathe. We were just talking about how redlining impacts green spaces. Now, Dr. Lance, whew, so much in that first part of the conversation. Let's move to another part of it. The lack of green spaces, which I think you've touched on already, and the impact it has had on on the community of Baltimore specifically. We understand the history, or at least are coming into more knowledge about it. We are now saying, okay, I am a community developer in real estate, and I am a person who always have been interested in real estate, want to get into real estate, not just flip houses and get my coin, though that is a part of the deal, but I want to be a part of purposeful ways in which I can contribute from a real estate perspective. How can community developers in real estate think about incorporating green spaces in their plans, for building or rebuilding areas?
I love that question. And there's some major developers in Baltimore already who are very active in getting that done. So I must pause for a moment and give kudos as an example to David Bramble, who is doing Madison Park North and the Inner Harbor. and Ray Jackson, who's doing Westport, and formerly known as Weller Development, who is there in Port Covington. They are very intentional about making sure that green space is a part of that redevelopment. To your question, what all three of them and others are doing, though, is heavy and intentional community engagement. That is absolutely critical. And I really think that that is the key to your question. One of the things that we've learned at Parks and People in our 38 years of existence is it is not our vision that we're trying to make sure comes to pass. It is that community's vision that we're helping them to realize. And so with any of our projects, and I'm seeing David Bramble do this, Ray Jackson do this, formerly Weller Development do this, before we put a shovel in the ground, before we come up with any concepts, we are meeting with those community members. We are doing heavy number of engagements and charrettes, and we're asking questions. What do you want here? What will it look like to say, yes, this is what I want? What don't you want? What do you want to see? What don't you want to see?
That's
Who
good.
do you, that's a question that must be asked. Who do you envision using this space, and how do you envision them using this space? How will it work in concert with and not in contrast to the housing or redevelopment that's going to be taking place? We do it with our playgrounds, with our active parks, with our passive parks, heavy community engagement. And then once we've asked all of those questions and we think that we have gathered all that information, we take all of that, and this is what a developer needs to do, and we come up with concept designs. This is what we think we heard. So out of all of our conversations, as you have put dots on the board of what you liked and what you didn't like, here's what we think we heard. Did we get it right? People will then come back and say, I like this, I don't like that. Can you change this? We then go through iterations on the concept design. Once we've gone through iterations on the concept design and we come up with a final concept, we then put a price against that and we're ready to move forward. But what we've done is, and here's the key, by way of that community engagement, we have community buy-in. It's not my park, it's the community's park. It's not my playground, it's the community's playground. And therefore, it has people who from the very beginning are willing to use it because it was their vision, are willing to help make sure that it's maintained because it was their vision, who see the benefit in it because it was their vision. So never should any developer come with a preconceived notion and say, here's what I'm going to do for you. That's a recipe of failure.
Yeah. Yeah.
What the company needs to be doing is saying, and allow me to teach this in a different way.
Please.
In my other hat, as a pastor of a local church, I've had to learn certain languages. And so in the common Greek, there's a word called therapeutos, which we translate today as healing, therapeutic, but it was therapeutos, we translate as healing. In the Koine Greek, it simply meant, how do you leave something better than you found it? I need somebody to hear that. How do you leave it better than you found it? The developer ought to approach the work saying, how do I leave this community better than I found it? And that means engaging the community in their vision. And that vision will include all of what we're discussing, the housing, the entertainment, the shopping, and the green space. And when that's done, you have a community for the benefit of all. And so, as you said, there's nothing wrong with getting developer fees. There's nothing wrong with making a profit, but everyone has benefited. And that's the key. And so that's how a developer brings to the table green space, that again, that intentionality I talked about. Engage the community, hear the community's voice, show the community that you really heard them by way of having concepts that show their voice, and then make that come to pass.
Yeah, that's so good. So many thoughts flying through my head, one in which is perhaps you speaking to, while there could be some really good developers with some great intentions, what could be some hindrances to progress on engaging with communities? Some of the things that come to my head are perhaps developers that don't look like us, right? Coming into a space they have no, knowledge or ties with and want to develop. What would be some um, challenges, right, that they would face in that scenario? And perhaps how would they overcome that?
And the they in this case, is it the developer or the community? Because
If
I
and we could attack it from both sides, but let's start with the developer. And maybe the developer who looks like us, what could be some challenges that they face in the community engagement portion of the conversation. We'll start there and then we'll go
okay.
to
Yeah, so I can give you a real clear answer on that one. One of the challenges that that developer could face is who is the authentic voice of the community and how do you find it? So when we start talking about community engagement, that's easier said than done because the issue becomes to whom do you reach out, right? To whom do you talk? One of the things that we have seen is that the authentic leaders of the community, they're known by the community, and that can be any number of different people. In the Cherry Hill community, lovingly we talk about Michael Middleton. We actually call him the mayor of Cherry Hill. Mike is known, Mike is revered, Mike is trusted, right? Doesn't hold any quote unquote official position,
right.
elected position per se. But Mike is known to be an advocate for Cherry Hill. And so as an example, if I'm a developer and I'm coming in Cherry Hill, I got to talk to Michael Middleton,
You got to talk
right?
to the people in the community
You got to
doing
talk to
the
the
thing.
people in the community, right?
Okay.
So we talk about what we call credible messengers. And what the developer has to do is find out who are those credible messengers. Who are those people who are already boots on the ground, working on behalf of the community, that the community knows, the community trusts, the community reveres, because you're going to need that individual. You're going to need he, she, they to vet what it is you're trying to do. And then in some cases, speak for you to the community.
That's good.
I've met with them. I know them. I pushed back on this. I made them change that. Y'all, this is now good for us,
Right.
right? And so when you talk about that developer who might not know, and he or she is coming in town working in community,
Right.
you have to find the credible messengers, and you have to give it time.
Hmm.
So
Okay. So
I'll
not
just say
overnight, not
this
no
is not
overnight
overnight. This is
perspectives.
authentic relationships take time.
Hmm.
Hear me, somebody. This is not a one night stand. Authentic relationships take time. That developer must be willing to put time in and allow time because the community needs to trust you. And then the last thing I'll say, the developer needs to be willing to put some things in writing. The community has had experience with being promised things that never happened. So one of the things that communities are becoming savvy enough to say is put that in writing.
When you
If
say
you're
that, Dr. Lance, just
Mhm,
quickly, what
mhm.
types of things need to be in writing?
All right, so in some cases, we're talking about community benefits agreements. So what will the community get out of the development? How will the community be better? Are you talking to developer about you will make sure that there's maintenance dollars for a certain project? Put that in writing. Are you saying that if you're doing multi-tier, multi-use development, that you're going to ensure that on the pedestal or first level, there'll be no establishment that has a negative for my community? So put things in writing that my community won't be damaged by way of this. So if you're
Hmm.
promising us a park that you're going to help maintain, then do that. Put that in writing. If you're promising us certain establishments, put that in writing. So what the community has learned is, because here's what happens. In a lot of cases, developers are going to ask the community members to go downtown in front of planning or BOE and testify on behalf of it. And in some cases we do these things and then none of what was promised actually happens. But our testimony is given, the approval has been given by planning or BOE, And
Mhm.
so what communities now are savvy enough to say is put it in writing.
Mhm. And just for those who may not know what BOE is, because we're all learning together, what's that?
And thank you. Thank you for having me change my acronym and giving it a name. So Baltimore City has the Board of Estimates. It is a 5-member board. It has the mayor, the city council, the controller, and 2 appointed positions by the mayor. Any amount of money that Baltimore City is spending that exceeds a certain threshold must be approved by Board of Estimates, or what we call BOE. And so in some cases, there'll be work that BOE has to approve, Board of Estimates. And typically what happens is that there is a public hearing, and there are people who can argue pro or con. Yes, we want the city to spend money this way. No, we don't. There's some, I'll give you a prime example of how this came into play in the greater Mondawmin community. We have what we call Mondawmin Mall. It is the shopping center in the Mondawmin community.
Mhm.
There's an urban planning design, a planned urban design, or PUD. The PUD needed to be changed in order to bring the TGI Fridays and the Chase Bank. The PUD had to be changed. So both the developer, the mall, and others asked community leaders like me to go down to Board of Estimates and ask for a change in the PUD. So one of the things that we did, we said, okay, we needed to have in writing what's the community benefits agreement. So we ended up with things like, yes, you're going to bring a Fridays, you're going to bring a Chase, but 70% of the employees need to come from this community, 212, 15, 16, and 17.
Mhm.
So get a little bit more savvy. And so, yes, you can support a project, but for us, we wanted to say, if we're going to support it, then we want the people that live here to be employed here.
Wow. 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 Okay. Learned a great deal about the lack of green space and the impact of the community, but also the components connected to that, and how various people can get engaged with the community. So we talked about people who look like us, who need to find those credible messengers that you mentioned. What about people who don't look like us, right? Perhaps have no ties with the area that they're intending to develop in. What would be some potential community engagement barriers that they might face, and how would they overcome?
So they're going to face similar issues. The issue really for me becomes, what are their true intentions? So I was
Yeah.
reading, I was
Which is what I was really getting to. Are we
right.
being a savior here, or what are we doing?
Exactly. I was reading an article recently that talked about the number of what we call squatters. So I'll go back to what I was saying earlier. Baltimore City is on the verge, it's on the precipice of a renewal, of a revival. We've lost a huge amount of population. There's a huge amount of area that can be redeveloped, and there are a number of people that know it. And so there are a number of developers then that are coming in, they're buying empty lots, they're buying vacant properties, they're waiting for it to improve or get better, and then they're going to invest, thinking, as we were discussing earlier, thinking that they're going to flip a property or flip some properties and make a profit and then just exit. The fact of the matter is, those kind of nefarious developers exist. They're there. The business opportunities are there for them to do that. So if their intention is nefarious, and by nefarious, I'm simply saying simply to make a profit, really could care less about the community,
Right.
they're just going to be in and out.
And
And,
displacement is also probably a part of that
and
plan.
displacement evident. So um, you and I were talking about ghettos earlier in this
Yes.
conversation. Let's talk about displacement and gentrification for a moment, because I think this is
Yes.
important when we talk about this idea of developers that don't look like us.
Hmm.
So displacement says, if I improve an area, and after I improve the area, the legacy resident, mama, grandmama, big mama, and that cadre can no longer afford to live here because now property tax rates have risen, or I feel like I'm the outsider and I can no longer afford to live here. We call that person the legacy resident. They have been displaced by way of the improvement that has taken place in the community. And so for all of you listening, one of the things that needs to happen with any development, you always need to be asking a question of, and use this language, what happens to the legacy resident? because what you want to make sure that happens is that improvement does not take place. And then the people who've lived there for generations can no longer afford to live there, right? We've seen these kind of developments take place in Baltimore. If we can be honest, I can name some, but I won't here, but call me privately if you want to know. But we've seen these kind of developments take place. And then the legacy resident who's lived there. So grandmama bought a home, you know, in the 20s and passed it down to somebody, and they passed it. Now they can no longer afford to live there. That's displacement. We cannot have that happen in Cherry Hill. We cannot have that happen in Westport. We cannot have that happen in East Baltimore. We cannot have that happen in West Baltimore. You always must ask the question, what happens to the legacy resident? That's displacement.
Which
But
ultimately too, Dr. Lance, just quickly potentially cancels out wealth for Black people.
It absolutely
and people
does.
of color. Yeah.
I'm so glad you stopped me there. It absolutely does. Look, I need us to understand the difference between an appreciating asset and a depreciating asset. An appreciating asset is one that you own that increases in value over the years. One of the things that has been a staple in appreciating assets is real estate. There are people who have purchased homes in cities all over this country. So I'm the boomer on this. All of you are too young to remember this, but I'm the boomer. There are people who bought homes in certain places of DC for $30,000, $40,000 now, where that community has improved. In that same 2-bedroom townhouse they bought for $30,000, $40,000 a generation ago can sell for $1 million today. Literally, no hyperbole, right? And it's happened in places all over this country. And so when we talk about wealth, and I'm really glad you stopped me, if you have an appreciating asset like a house and the community improves, there's some store that comes, there's some business that comes, there's some major improvement. So in West Baltimore, we're talking now about demolishing the highway to nowhere and building some great almost 2-mile stretch of parkland. Home values will increase, right? And if I own there, I've just instantly got more worth. And if I pass that down to generations, I am building generational wealth. Right. And so I'm really glad you stopped that versus the depreciating assets. Oh God, don't have me on this. The depreciating assets where we buy something and the second we buy it, it's losing value. People invest in appreciating assets and stop focusing on depreciating assets. The second we buy them, they're losing value. But I also wanted to go to gentrification because you raised this earlier with ghetto. Y'all, can we talk about gentrification and understand the words? We started this conversation talking about coded language. To gentrify, the verb to gentrify simply means to improve, to make better. That's all it means. Gentrification, the noun, simply means the act of making better. But somehow we've now conflated it, and this irritates me. Yeah. We've conflated it with a change in the racial demographics. God, white supremacy, white privilege is something. We have taken a word which simply means to make better, and we have now conflated it to say that the only way we can make it better is to change the racial percentage. That is a lie that's come straight from the pits of hell. You do not need to change the races in order for an area to improve. I talked earlier about Port Covington. Port Covington got a multi-$100 million TIF, tax incremental financing. If we invested in other communities the way that we have, say, in Port Covington, I can improve it without changing the racial demographics, right? And so I need us to push back on this idea that the only way that we can improve a community is to what we now call gentrify and changing the racial dynamics. No, demand investment in your own community. Demand. Baltimore City got $641 million in the American Rescue Plan Act. 641 million. You need to be demanding money The state of Maryland right now has a budget surplus. We got it. We have a new governor coming in. There's going to be a new administration. We got the ARPA funding. What are you demanding as far as capital flowing into your community? You can improve it without displacing people, and you can improve it without necessarily changing the racial demographics. Now, if you end up with a different racial mix, that's one thing. But don't tell me that in order for it to get better, I've got to change the racial demographics.
Ooh. Which in my head, and I could be wrong, but gentrification could be a modern version of redlining, but we won't go there. And I guess I'll just say that because it's then changing hands. We're no longer in the home team anymore. We've been displaced. The wealth passing down line has been broken. And must I say, it would be hard to get back into those areas, because then at that point, you know, the pricing to get in would be super high.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So take DC. I mentioned it earlier. This is not hyperbole. I'm talking about facts I know from people. So let's use your example. Grandmama bought a home for $30,000. That community now, she can sell that home for $1 million. But let's say somehow her family gets displaced. You talk about the ability to buy back in. Who's going to buy back in at $1 million?
Yeah.
Right. And so when we start talking about just the funds that's necessary, if I want to buy into that $1 million community and avoid the private mortgage insurance or the PMI, that means I need a $200,000 down payment. Who has $200,000 in discretionary cash just sitting in their account to buy back into this community? And then who can afford the mortgage? Who can afford the property taxes? Right. And so it goes absolutely, yeah, it goes on and on and on. So appreciating asset, don't displace people, and don't buy into the lie that the only way it can get better is if a different racial demographic has it.
Wow, we are speaking with Dr. Frank Lance of Parks and People, also a cherished reverend and pastor in the local community here in Baltimore. While we have a couple minutes, I maybe a couple questions that come up, and one is, what can we do about green spaces? And I know we've touched on this in our conversation, but just in a way of a small summary, what can we do as community developers in real estate? What can we do about it today? What could be a few practical steps from this conversation that we can do that can move the needle a little bit forward towards including green spaces or protecting green spaces in our communities? And while we're talking about this in Baltimore, I'm sure this is applicable to urban areas, and not urban, but inner city areas everywhere. So Dr. Lance, tell us.
I absolutely love that question. And one of the things that I see in Baltimore, and I do believe, and I do agree it's applicable other places, is engage the local philanthropic communities. So Baltimore City has a number of different foundations. And for all of you who are with us today, remember, these foundations, in order to keep their status, they're required to give away 5% of their assets annually. So this is not, as much as we want to talk about it being altruistic or for the good, this is a requirement in order to keep that status, 5%, right? So they're looking to give funds to causes that are aligned with why they exist. So one of the things that we need to start doing is taking the time and engage those foundations that are willing to do this. Let me give an example. You talk about applicable around the country. Let me give an example that comes out of Philadelphia. Philadelphia, a few years ago, started something called Rebuild Philly. And it's about green space, recreation centers, and libraries. And so they have funding that is restricted for green space, libraries, and recreation centers. Why do I mention it? The seed funding for that program came from the William Penn Foundation. And that foundation, the seed funding was $100 million. And I'm mentioning this because when we talk about parks and green space, it's twofold. You got to build it, but then you got to maintain it. And one of the issues that always happens is We can find capital to build it, but we rarely think about how do we maintain it, right? So how do we keep the grass fresh? How do we keep things cut? If there's any signage, how do we keep the trash out of it? And so I would say for developers, work with your communities and engage the local philanthropic foundations there. And there are ways then of even tying that to workforce development. Foundation, help me with seed money so we can take some people, maybe some people in the corner, maybe returning citizens, and we can give them employment and helping to maintain some of these green spaces. But there's always capital to build it. How do we maintain it? And so one of the action items I would take away with this is developers, don't look away from or think it's unnecessary to engage the philanthropic community. There are funds there that can help your projects exponentially be better.
We talked about funding it, maintaining it. What about activation? What are some ideas that, just so that these green spaces don't become less savory places to hang out in
Mhm.
and ultimately become cemeteries in a way.
Yep.
What are some ideas on activation, keeping people there, getting people involved?
I'm glad you raised that because I glossed over that earlier. So I'm glad you raised that.
Yeah.
When I was talking earlier about community engagement, I was mentioning what do you want there? What don't you want there? Who do you see using it? Part of those questions are also, how will we keep it activated? And so at Parks and People, we have a full-time employee who looks at activation of the spaces that we work on, but we also work with those communities. How will you keep this activated? What is necessary? What do we need to do here? And so for activities that are for the places we build that are at schools, we work with PTAs and PTOs. How will we keep it activated? We look for some kind of anchor. It could be a church, could be a community association, but to your point, we want to make sure that it's not just built and maintained, but it's used. And that's why that earlier community engagement is so vital. You're asking those kinds of questions. You're making sure that the roles and responsibilities are known. You're making sure that the possibilities are talked about. I'm pleased to say at a number of the ones that we've built, there are it becomes community gathering places. They've done movie nights and they've had choirs come out and sing, and
Yeah.
they've had cookouts for their
Celebration.
communities. They've had celebrations,
Yeah.
right? They've done parades, those kind of things. But again, it's not happenstance, it's intentional. It's talked about even before the project is done.
Yeah.
How do you envision this being used? Who's going to use it? Who has the responsibility of planning it? And so it didn't just happen. It was intentional from the earliest stages of design.
Last piece of that is, so we talked about funding, we talked about maintenance, activation, but also personality of the space. Does your green space have a name? What about the history? Is that on display somewhere? Are there seating areas? Things like that. Personality, can you speak to how green spaces can take on personality in a way? Maybe there are some trees being planted or whatever. I'll leave that to you, Dr. Lance.
I absolutely love the question. And again, that's part of that community engagement, and we absolutely do it. So we have one project that we did in West Baltimore in 2016. The formal name of it is McKean Street, but we call it, its personality is Miracle on McKean Street. So it was open space that was known for crime, known for drug activity, and we've now revived it. And so now it's called the Miracle on McKean, right? We have others where we put up historic artifacts. We are currently in the design stage of an African-American historical trail in the Middle Branch. It will have historic artifacts along the trail, one of which a lot of people might not know, but in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Baltimore Black Sox, there was a Negro League baseball team in Baltimore that played in Westport. We're going to do a memorial to the Baltimore Black Sox along that trail, right? So it will have that kind of culture, that kind of feel, right? We're doing others. We're doing a trail for Mount Washington Pediatric, and there will be artifacts that will talk about the 100-year history of the Mount Washington Pediatric Hospital. So again, I'm going all the way back to that community engagement and that kind of intentional effort. What will be the environment? What will be the culture? What will people feel? And all of that needs to come into place. So one that I'm really proud of, and I'll mention this and toss this back to you, everyone I believe will remember in April of 2015, Baltimore City was seen around the world for our civil unrest. And ground zero was Penn North. We are building a park at Penn North. And right now we're looking at calling it Resurrection Park. And so the idea is to say, here's where civil unrest took place in April of 2015. And now we've resurrected this area from a place where cars were being overturned and buildings were on fire and people stood face to face with Baltimore City Police, to now you have a meditative, resurrective type place where you can gather and not point back to the civil unrest, but point to your future about where you can go. So absolutely, these green spaces need to take on a culture and environment, but that comes into planning. It's not unintentional, it's not happenstance, it's planned.
It's planned. It can't be alone. So you need people. Even think about artists that you can incorporate with their sculptures or their artwork.
And murals.
Murals, yep. Perfect way to, these are ways that we can begin to revive green spaces and begin to believe that we can breathe better air. Is it too late, Dr. Lance, for us to breathe better air and engage green spaces?
So it absolutely is not. One of the things I believe you mentioned, serve as a pastor of a local church, I believe in the resurrection power of God. And so it is not too late. God renews daily. The prophet would say, morning by morning, new mercies. God renews daily. And so we still have an opportunity here to breathe new air, to breathe better air, to look at trees, clean water, but we have to be intentional.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frank Lance, for your time with us today, sharing, oh my goodness, on so many fabulous, valuable, meaningful, useful points and ways we can breathe better air, and also understand how green spaces have been impacted by redlining and what we can do. Because there is a lot we can do, from volunteering. Maybe that's your way in. Maybe connecting and engaging and creating relationships with people. Maybe that's your way in. There is something for everyone to do on every level. Dr. Lance, I can't say enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you. How could folks, if they want to just learn more about you, learn what you're doing at Parks and People, where can they find you?
And so again, thank you for having me. For anyone who wants to follow up with me, please, I invite you and encourage you to. We are at Parks and People, our website, parksandpeople.org. So feel free to reach me there. I promise you, you reach out to me, I will reach back out to you and we can engage. We do volunteer events. So if anyone wants to volunteer, help us maintain any of our parks or green spaces, I encourage you to reach out. Again, thank you for having me here today. I hope that this has been helpful for somebody, and I'm here if anyone wants to follow up.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Lance.
Thank you.